welcome everyone here. We have actually now it's climbed up to 68 attendees, so that's great. You are joining a webinar which has been presented by the Public Health Association of Australia and the Political Economy of Health Special Interest Group. And the webinar is titled An Economy That Guarantees Health and Wellbeing for All and the Right to Work and Income Security. So to start the proceedings, I'll do an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm meeting and live on the land of the Gadigal and Wongal peoples of the Eora Nation. And I acknowledge the descendants of those people who are still with us today. And thank you to Public Health Association for hosting this, and a warm welcome to our guests. So Noel, John and Bill.
Hello.
We also have Tim and there's Prue as well. So I'll start with the brief introductions about our guests. Noel Pearson is one of Australia's leading thinkers. He comes from the Gogo Yimadeer community of Hope Vale in the southeastern Cape York Peninsula. And Noel is a lawyer, academic and land rights activist. He is also a brilliant orator, as evidenced in his many speeches, but particularly the one I watched this afternoon, which is Gough Whitlam's eulogy speech, which was brilliant. He's founder of Cape York Institute for Policy and Leadership, an organisation promoting economic and social development of Cape York. And Noel has recently founded a coalition with Bill Mitchell. And I think I'll leave it to them to explain the nature of this coalition. So we'll talk about that throughout the discussion. I'll hand it over to you, Tim, to introduce John Quiggan. So.
Thanks very much, Jane. John is an economist, author and blogger and professor at the University of Queensland, formerly an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and Federation Fellow, and a member of the board of the Climate Change Authority, and was recently ranked by Academic Influence as number 20 on a list of most influential economists. He's written a book, a fascinating book called Zombie Economics, How Dead Ideas Still Walk Amongst Us. But he's written a lot more since, and has recently co-authored a policy brief on the Livable income guarantee. And just one other thing I'd like to say about John is that in the survey The Conversation did recently of economists pre-budget as to how they'd list a variety of topics of things that the government might do, he rated just the same things as me as very good and very bad. So I have confidence in John coming today. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Tim, for that generous introduction. I should say I've written extensively on my rankings of those rubbish, so I'll take that with a grain of salt. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the land of the Jagera people, and to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So both Bill and I have been working on these topics for a great many years.
Actually, I might just do a quick intro for Bill and then we'll kick off.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were actually talking, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'll do a quick intro for Bill, and then I have brief housekeeping just to, and then
sorry about that.
We'll kick it. No, that's okay. So Bill Mitchell comes to us from Newcastle at the moment. He's an academic author and a prolific blogger. He is a professor in economics and director of the Centre of Full Employment Equity at the University of Newcastle, and one of the founding developers of modern monetary theory, which is a school of thought that you may have come across recently in the media. It's been gaining sort of increased prominence, and particularly in the political discourse. I think there was something today in the Australian Financial Review about Josh Frydenberg, anti-MMT, something or other. So I didn't get to read that yet. So the format of the webinar today will be that each of our guests will have make an opening statement and about how their work seeks to address the issue of the right to work and income security, and outline briefly, you know, some of what their work is. So including sort of John's Livable income guarantee and Bill and Noel on the job guarantee. So John, would you like to start off?
Before you go on, Jane, would you like to give us that housekeeping stuff?
Oh, sorry, and the housekeeping stuff, yep. So the housekeeping is that we will be having a live Q&A. We're going to stagger the Q&A from attendees with our the questions from the moderators, myself and Tim. So we'll be looking at the Q&A box. Any questions that you'd like to have answered by the panelists will need to be written into the Q&A box. If you'd like to ask your question live, you can raise your hand, and to do that is beside your name in the I think there's an option down here in the control, the function panel, to raise your hand, and doing that will mean that you can ask that question live. So live audio, live video also if you'd like. So we'll be monitoring the Q&A box and work through the questions as they are placed in there, and they'll be just addressed from first in, best dressed, basically. So we'll be looking at the timestamps and looking at questions on that basis. So I guess also just as a intro to the Political Economy of Health Special Interest Group, it is looking at how the political and economic determinants of population health can be both promotive and promote health and contribute to risk factors for poor health. And it is considering sort of a health in all policies approach. So right from, I guess, public finance as a public health issue. So a government that properly finances the public sector, or, you know, ensures a full employment economy. So and the social determinants of health, and how government policy can ensure and secure housing, education, healthcare, and all the other social determinants of health. So Tim, I'll hand it over to John, or would you like to make a comment before we do that?
Yeah, so this has come out of the Political Economy of Health Committee Special Interest Group in PHHA, and the ideas of basic income guarantee and job guarantee have been discussed a little in the last year or so, and we think that one of the concerns that should come from any health group is the way that we have an organisation such as Centrelink, which represents the power of the government to control what happens to people that are the most disadvantaged people in our society. We know that we have a very targeted welfare system. In 2014, the OECD showed that Australia has the most targeted, least wasteful, if you like, welfare system in the OECD, and that was before, for example, women, mothers with children over 8 were put on to New Start, and indeed before Robodebt. So we have a Centrelink and welfare system that, for many of the most disadvantaged, is disempowering, punitive, and demonising, and very distressing. Now, what we see with health groups throughout the country, advocacy groups, is that they're certainly trying to address the problems of inequity, but generally not on the basis of structural change, partly because it's often too hard. But we do know that relative income inequality and wealth inequality are very closely aligned with health outcomes across the spectrum and across the income spectrum, so that wealthy people live longer than middle income earners, who live longer than low income earners. So we know that these things should be addressed, and it's the problem is that they tend not to be addressed, these structural barriers. And so it's really pleasing to have 3 people today who are talking about those very basic, looking at ways to overcome some of those very basic issues, rather than looking at a particular program that addresses a particular inequity, and doing it very well, but working against the economic structures that are already in place. So I think now it's going to be great to have the 3 of you talking, and I'll pass back to Joan.
I think now we'll start with the opening statements. So thanks, John. We'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. As I said, both Bill and I have been working on these issues for a very long time, and therefore have had plenty of experience to see that the labour market, as it works as it's worked for the last 40 or 50 years, has failed to deliver stable and full employment. We've had repeated economic crises here and around the world, and even before the arrival of the pandemic, we were seeing a significant deterioration in the Australian labour market, particularly in the area of underemployment. So that sort of suggests we need some fairly radical change. But in my work, what I've tried to do is not be constrained by what our current political leaders would be willing to accept, but to stick to things which can be implemented, broadly speaking, within the current kind of budgetary framework that we have, and where we can actually work out what kinds of revenue measures would be needed to support policy, rather than setting genuinely utopian goals. There's a place for that, and I've advocated, but I'm just saying that's what I'm doing. So that means schemes, policies which are radical in the political context of Labor and Liberal as they stand, but not way outside what could be done by a government if it suddenly chose to. And after things like the introduction of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, I think things which I would never have imagined possible, I think while that doesn't guarantee anything else good, it certainly suggests that worrying too much about what's acceptable is not the answer. So in terms of a vision of how work should work in our society, I think there are 2 aspects to it. One, obviously paid work is central to a large proportion of the population, and obviously we need a lot of it. On the other hand, we've seen the erosion of paid work as a norm in all sorts of respects. The erosion of standard full-time work, the erosion of permanence in employment, the continued the rise of the gig economy, the continued displacement of some categories of workers by technological change and so forth. So I think the vision which I and the people I've worked with on this is an ideal society is one where paid work is available to everybody who wants it, but where it's possible to live by making a contribution other than in the paid labour market. So an essential part of this is taking a broader notion of what constitutes work, such that people can have a decent standard of living without supporting that through paid work. And that's where the Livable Income Guarantee proposal comes from. We start from, I guess, 2 things. One is the higher rate of benefits being paid under JobSeeker, which of course has been cut back, but is still above the grossly inadequate rate of New Start. And the other is the success of the age panel in largely eliminating age poverty, not totally, and there's a bunch of people right on the edge depending on how you measure it. But broadly speaking, compared to other problems in our society, age poverty, which used to be a big deal, has ceased to be one. And obviously the social judgment here very different from the judgment made of in lots of other respects is if somebody's reached pension age, we don't inquire into whether they worked hard in their life beforehand or whether they were a good or a bad person or any of those things. They're eligible for the pension subject to a generous test which says if you have higher income in other respects, which almost certainly means you've benefited from superannuation concessions, your eligibility for the pension is scaled back. So our starting point would be to raise all the existing benefits permanently to the age pension rate. That would mean replacing JobKeeper with a benefit equal to the pension rate, and that automatically would reverse the cuts which Tim mentioned to supporting parents benefits, since they would be aligned with the same benefit. But then to allow a range of contributions other than the ones we've covered so far, which are attaining a suitable age, being active in job search or raising dependent children, extend eligibility for a range of contributions, which can include volunteering, artistic and cultural activities, potentially a grant for people starting a small business in the early stages. And a further part of this, which relates to the kinds of concerns that have already been raised, is that we should treat the whole thing as an integrated tax welfare system, which most economists looking at the question seek to. That implies, I think, a consistent approach to compliance. Our approach to compliance in the tax system is to say people tell the government what they've done, and then if the government has a reason to doubt it, they can check on it, and you can be obviously penalised for giving misleading information. We don't have hordes of people doing random weekly spot checks to make sure that people aren't cheating on their tax, even though we know that lots of them in fact are. So that's the core of the kind of proposal that we're putting forward. And because it largely consists of filling in gaps in the existing system and of course making it more generous, in economic terms, the livable income guarantee part of it is entirely feasible in budgetary terms. It's essentially on the same scale as the stage 3 tax cuts, entirely for upper income earners, which are still there in the budget for 2024. I haven't talked about full employment policies. We mentioned them in the paper, but I've been talking about those for a long time, and Bill will have, I know, has his own specific proposals on that. I'm happy to discuss the ways in which my ideas on that both overlap and differ from Bill's, but maybe it'd probably be better if he says his piece first and we can discuss things in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, John. We will, I'm sure, have questions related to the livable income guarantee, and I, having just briefly read through some of your articles about it, I saw that there was a lot of overlap in the sort of the goals and the motivations of the job guarantee, and I'll be interested to hear the discussion around what differences there are between the two approaches. So Bill, if you could now, would you be able now to make your opening statement?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I take a slightly different view about working within the system and crushing the system. And what I mean by that, to John that is, what I mean by that is that if we assemble a report card, then what we broadly call neoliberalism, and I know there's all debates about that and they're valid debates, but for the sake of terminology, the overarching ideological framework that has driven the political discourse and then the policy interventions has failed. It's unquestionable that it's failed. You can just tick it off, and the sort of things that Tim said at the beginning. It's created institutional structures that punish the most disadvantaged people. It transfers income from workers to capital at an alarming rate. The wage share in national income used to be in the high 50s. It's now below 50%. It's created massive gains to the top end of the wealth and income distribution and kept the bottom end fairly flat. And it's created elevated levels of unemployment and underemployment. It's created a gig economy that's destroying the future of our youth. It's degraded public services and public infrastructure. And public infrastructure has just become a profit-seeking, rent-seeking game for private capital. And really importantly, it's created a climate and health disaster. And so on any one of those is sufficient to say it's failed, but overall it's failed. Now the question is, well, why has it failed? And it's failed because, for a number of reasons, but from my expertise, it's failed because the underlying economic theory that was used to justify it to us and make the promises that we would all do well out of this was wrong in the first place. The underlying theory that justifies the whole structure that we live in is wrong. And what that structure has created, so that we've gone along for so long, for 3 or 4 decades, with this obscene attack on our spirit, our society, our well-being. It's created a fictional world. So mainstream economics creates a fictional world and lures us into believing its knowledge and it has an authority that it doesn't have, and lures us into making all sorts of decisions about our lives, including voting for particular governments and policy mixes that undermine our prosperity. And we believe that the economists are telling us the truth. Well, I'm here to say that they're lying. It's fake knowledge in using the sort of current terminology. Now, I'm old enough to have lived through a paradigm shift in economic theory. So in the mid-70s, when I was just a young student, that's when monetarism took over from, I'm not sure what we'll call it, but most people call it the Keynesian period. And I'm not holding out the Keynesian period as the utopia, but there was a paradigm shift. So the idea, and that emerged, we don't have to go into it, but that emerged because of a massive dislocation in our global economy, particularly driven by the oil crises in 1973, the start of it. And the point I'm making is that just assuming that you have to work within the current economic framework, and let's see if we can tweak it a bit to make things a little bit better, to me is ignoring the fact that it's deeply failed, it's unsalvageable. We've got a climate disaster on our hands, we've got a health disaster now, we've got a social disaster on our hands. The economic theory that justifies has created all of that in part is irretrievable. And so my efforts have been to develop an alternative way of thinking about economics. And so I think the way ahead is not to operate within the system, tweaking it a bit, but to conduct a mass education program that helps people understand that fictional world, and through the political processes, change it. And there was a reason in the late 19th century why trade unions formed and why welfare states became the norm. It's because citizens had had enough. And even though the elites had the power, and the reason why social democracy formed and became the overwhelming paradigm in the post-war period was because we had had enough. And through political processes, we did something about it. And we were educated differently then to think in collective societal terms, to think in terms that full employment was valuable, to think in terms that the role of the state was to advance well-being. And that's what I believe has to be the way forward. And that requires somewhat radical, not just radical in terms of what we think is centre now, but radical. We need to kill off this system. And that's where I come from. And that's my opening statement.
Okay. So we're just in answer to some of the last comments that you make. I think being radical is really what being radical now is probably what it's all really shifted from the centre through. There's been a shift away from progressive values, which have been more universal values of caring for the environment and caring for each other and caring for community, and those have been eroded in the decades of the neoliberal era. And
the Menzies government was way further left than the current Labor Party.
Yeah. Okay, so Noel, I'll move to you now for your opening statement, and then we'll go to some questions.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I'm obviously not an economist. I'm an advocate and strategist for my people. Ever since I was going through university and seeing the social disaster playing out amongst the people that I most love in the world, the people to whom I am the most faithful, the people whose welfare and well-being I and others of my generation have made the very purpose of our life. Their well-being is the purpose of my public life. 20 years ago, having long held a sense that some very good things were falling apart. Very good things like growing up in a family and being absolutely convinced that there were no more fortunate children in the world than us. I had a great parents, poor, 2-bedroom, fibro shack with an outdoor toilet at the back of the yard, cockroaches galore, many days of the week without a square meal. But my father was a good father, and my mother, who was illiterate, was a good mother. And there were such beautiful things. We were poor, but we had beautiful things that made us a strong people. If there ever was this mythical village where every child was raised by the village and not just their mother and father, that was my life. And it was the life of all of my generation. Fortunately, we had just emerged from discrimination. My father had worked all of his youth and for most of his adult life for unequal wages. He didn't get the same wages as his fellow workers, punching cattle, working in the butcher shop, working as a handyman, going out of the mission to look for work down on the Gold Coast or in the sugarcane fields. He didn't get the same wages, and the wages that he did get were managed compulsorily by the state. And the state took those wages and built hospitals for white people in Toowoomba. Then they removed the discrimination. And what did the cattle stations do? The cattle stations drove the Aboriginal families off the stations and into the settlements. And the policy question at the time was, well, what are we going to do with these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of families that are no longer living and working on the cattle stations? They're on the fringe of the country town now, or they're back in the mission, and there's no income for them. The policy decision that was taken after the 1965 equal wages case was to put people on unemployment benefits. And for the first time, people had money like they had never had before. The problem I was dealing with, or thinking about more than 20 years after that, at the end of the 1980s and into the 90s, was why was it that notwithstanding unemployment benefits that were greater than any income we had ever received prior to the 1970s, why was it that our social parameters were deteriorating? None of my people had been in jail. The rate of imprisonment of people in our communities in Cape York was lower than the average weight in Queensland. The same was the case in the Kimberley. The rate of child removal and juvenile detention, these were things that were creeping up on us. Substance abuse epidemics started to get going, not in 1930, not in 1950, in the 1980s. The first suicide in my community happened in 1993. It was the first time anybody had suicided in the mission in 120 years. It was a cocktail of cannabis and alcohol. And then other suicides followed. I started thinking about all of this. I wondered why it was that the substance abuse epidemics were raging, and increasingly the children were being neglected. That was why we embarked on our reform agenda, and we formed an analysis that we needed work. We needed employment. Life on unemployment benefits in perpetuity was not working for us. We were getting unhealthy and our social condition was deteriorating. We needed jobs. Now, like ships passing in the night, I heard about Bill Mitchell's Centre for Full Employment and Equity 20 years ago when we started. But I never connected with his work. Instead, I have for the past 2 decades accepted the general opinion of Australians and all Australians, the bipartisan opinion, that when it comes to economics, the liberal paradigm that prevailed back 20 years ago and still prevails today is correct. It can't be challenged. So when they say they can't afford to create jobs for people at the bottom of the pyramid, I accepted that. I accepted that government job creation programs are anathema. We shouldn't even talk about full employment. We should accept that ours is a system that needs a residual amount of unemployed people, and my people comprise a very large percentage of the perpetually unemployed. I can't believe I accepted that. I just cannot believe I've gone through 2 decades not challenging that. Because I accepted the orthodoxy that the country can't afford to provide employment for everyone that needs it, that wants it. And the social disaster, and the funerals, and the misery, and the ill health. I can point to you families and family lineages that are near extinct. Some families are so ravaged from diabetes, from alcohol, such that I can't see who are the next generation when the last of them die. And I think of my own culpability for not standing up to the assumption that somehow 5 or 6% unemployment is a policy choice and not an inevitability. It's a policy choice that's been made by successive governments in Australia since the mid-70s. And when I came upon Bill's writings about this, it has enraged me. It has enraged me. It is so unfair. This country has made provision for its original peoples, not just at the bottom of the pyramid, a perpetual condition, but has said to them, we can't afford to give you a job. The country can't afford to give you an entry-level minimum wage job, the like of which I know could turn this thing around. It could turn this social condition around. So that's why a minute I heard about the job guarantee and the design that Coffey has had on the books for 2 decades now. The minute I heard about it, I would say that it is absolutely the most important measure we need to take. You want to turn around incarceration rates? We've got to get a job. You want to turn around poor health? We've got to get a job. You want to reconstruct and strengthen families? We've got to get a job. And I just, as I say, let me say one last thing. I just regret that over 2 decades, I have not been challenging the economic assumptions that the major political parties have been pursuing over the last 3 to 4 decades. Why haven't we woken up to this? Why haven't we insisted that the most disadvantaged people in Australia have got to be given a fair share of their country? Not just blackfellas, the whitefellas who are down there in the hole with us. That's why I find Bill's economic analysis and policies so compelling. It's time for us to wake up and not accept this criminal situation where the most disadvantaged people in the country, the underclass, are carrying such a huge burden for the rest of the country and all the costs they pay as a consequence. And of course, at the end of the day, all of this cost is borne in the bodies of people. You want to do the calculation of the cost, check the bodies of the people. And it's not good.
Thank you, Noel. I think you speak for, I mean, you're an amazing advocate for your people, and you speak for a vast number of Australians who have been relegated to the very bottom of the labour market and excluded from our economy, and deliberately and strategically excluded from our economy. And it's been an experiment, a very cruel experiment in which has shifted the powers from, you know, democratic powers and ruined our democratic powers, the powers of the people, and a government for the people, by the people, of the people, and given it to the market. And the market has really brought us to the point that we're at today, where we're facing you know, rising levels of inequality and poverty and very poor health outcomes across the world, with a climate disaster-induced pandemic and facing a 6th extinction. So I think it would be, I think now, looking at how the differences in the job guarantee, which you've alluded to and Bill has alluded to, and the livable income guarantee, which do both have quite, you know, significant overlap, and maybe there could be a discussion between both Bill and John and also Noel in terms of looking at the role of work and the, you know, the responsibility, what you have said, the right to take responsibility and the duty to work in a way to contribute to your community, and the dignity that comes from that. So I think it would be nice to, or it'd be great to nut out some of the differences between the two approaches, but also looking at how, in a macroeconomic sense, what's most feasible. So can we maybe get John and Bill commenting on that, and Noel also. So John, would you like to start? I think you're muted. Can you unmute yourself? Are you all right now?
Yeah, so there's a question in the Q&A, I think, about similarities and differences between approaches to full employment in my 1994 book with John Langmore, which is pretty much in large measure still where I stand, and Bill's approach. I think I'll let some of the details of Bill's approach, I think I'll let him spell out. But I suppose the similarity, I think, first is that we reject notions like the Nehru, the idea that we need to maintain high levels of unemployment to keep inflation under control. I think it's, I was observing how we're supposed to find this is that we cut unemployment until inflation accelerates, and inflation rate hasn't accelerated in the past 25 years, which raises the question of how policymakers can have any idea where that rate is. But certainly it's well below where we've seen unemployment stuck for ever since the global financial crisis. So at that level, I think there's a strong level of agreement. And I think the next point is the central role of the public sector, that looking at a combination, certainly in my book with John Langmore, of expansion of human services as the most labour intensive and sector of the economy, and for a wide range of skills, backed up by then policies backed up by policies including potentially wage subsidies like JobKeeper, but also direct temporary job creation, which is probably closer to the specific mechanics of the job guarantee that's been outlined more recently. So that I think is the main similarity. I think I don't want to put Bill into a specific position here. There's a lot of opposition between job guarantee and income guarantee advocates, whereas I'm in the position of believing that both have their place to play. That, as I said at the beginning, that we both want employment to be wage employment to be available for everyone who wants it, but also for it to be possible to support yourself by making a different kind of contribution to society. And I think I'll let Bill have his say on what he thinks about that.
Okay, me?
Yeah.
The transition from the full employment era, which largely, you know, when governments around the world after the war, Second World War, were working out how they could, because the Great Depression didn't end until the war. And it ended when the governments decided to spend a lot of money to build weapons to kill each other, the citizens in their countries. And so that's when the penny dropped, that using fiscal deficits would generate high pressure economies, high pressure being lots of employment, and everybody could get a job. And in the challenge of the peace in the sort of early days after the war was, well, how are we going to do that when we're not bombing the hell out of each other? And this is when these great white papers emerged, big mission statements from all of the major governments around the world in different ways, different forms. And so the Australian government in 1945 issued the white paper on full employment. Now, for those who have never read it, I took the liberty some years ago, because you can't really find it anymore. So you can now find a digital version on my website, and you can read it and get inspired by it, because this was a big nation building statement. And this was an acceptance that the government was foremost in our economy to build infrastructure, to build services that were available to all the citizens, and to create full employment. In other words, to make sure there were enough jobs for everybody. And this was the underlying philosophical view was that we were a collective, we were a society, and that we lived in it and we contributed to it as best we could. And the government's duty and responsibility was to make sure we had opportunities to do that. That was the sort of consensus that society achieved in this period. It was a collective will where the government would make sure there were enough jobs, and For those who weren't able to work for age reasons, sickness, disability, they would be well looked after. And for the ones that could work, they would have jobs available. And the concept of unemployment benefits in those days was a really short-term temporary thing. Because unemployment was just a 2-week affair, just moving between jobs. And so nobody ever conceived of unemployment benefits as being a living wage or a permanent income for somebody. The responsibility to the collective was job creation. And the government's created a whole lot of jobs in the career, high-skilled area and provided lots of apprenticeship training and expansion of secondary and tertiary education to feed the skills that were appropriate for those jobs. And that wasn't sufficient to create full employment. What was the final part of that little story was that they created a buffer of jobs all through the public sector, that the most disadvantaged workers on any day of the week could get a job. Down the rail yards, in the housing sector, in the road sector, in the local government sector, they were always you could pick up a job. And those jobs were available to all sorts of different people at different stages in their lives. And as a young student, I used to go down the Spencer Street rail yards in Melbourne, where I grew up, and I could always get a job on packing the rail yards, the rail cars. Any day I wanted a bit of income, I could go and get it. And down there, my fellow workers would be drug addicts, alcoholics, people just released from Pentridge jail, people with episodic illnesses, and they could always get a job and feel productive and feel as though they were contributing. And then we moved from that to the neoliberal era and the aspiration of government was full employability. So we shifted from a demand side concept of providing work to full employability, the supply side concept, that we would just sort of shuffle the queue of unemployed people that we deliberately created through our fiscal austerity, and we'd turn it into a rat race of these terrible training providers. And then we privatised the Commonwealth Employment Service, which had previously been a fantastic vehicle for moving people into jobs that were available always. We turned that into Centrelink, and we created a new industry, the unemployment management industry, otherwise known as the Job Network or whatever, Job Services Australia and all the rest of it. We pretended it was a competitive market. It wasn't. Government set the price, and we created an industry where sociopaths could run riot. And as Tim said at the beginning, run riot means invoke the worst type of human behaviour towards disadvantaged citizens that you could conceive in one of the most wealthiest countries in the world. And we lost the collective will, and we started to think in individual terms. And we started to have divide and conquer language. So dole bludgers entered the scenario, the language. Cruisers, drifters, job snobs, all of this stuff, to turn those with jobs against those that we've deliberately made unemployed. And so then we have an erosion of mental health, an erosion of family stability, increased poverty, and all the rest of the pathologies. So my view is that I want to live in a society that's not divide and conquer, that doesn't vilify the disadvantaged, and I want governments to return to their responsibility for providing jobs for all. And I don't want to live in a society that sees us all as individuals. Yeah, I'm a real maverick. I'm a libertarian individual, but I also feel as I've got responsibilities to John and to Noel and to Jane and to Tim and all of the other 20 whatever million people that live in this society, and to everybody else in the world. And that means that I feel as though if I'm given the opportunity, I should use whatever skills I've got and take advantage of that opportunity that the government is guaranteeing in one way or another to give back to everybody and to maximise what we've all created together. And the problem I've got with UBI is that it's a neoliberal construct. It's seeing us as individual consumption units, and it's denying the fact that governments can create the work and saying, how do we solve the problem of poverty that arises from the inevitable unemployment because governments can't create the work? And how we'll solve it, we'll give people a dollop of income so they can keep consuming and making profit for private capitalists. And we'll tell them to piss off and not demand anything more from us. Well, I think we should be demanding jobs for everybody. And we shouldn't be seeing people as consumption units. Work is we're social animals. And part of living in a society is that we contribute and we get pride and status and we meet people and we get social location. Now, how I can bridge the gap with John, and John and I have discussed this at some length, is that I think and this will be the final thing I say at this point, one of the real problems we've got in this neoliberal society is the way we value contribution. And economists use the term productivity. Now, our concepts of productivity come from the 1930s, the gainful worker framework. And the gainful worker hypothesis or framework said, you are gainfully employed if you're adding value that is realisable as profit in the private economy. Now, I think productivity is so much more broader than that, and I would prefer to define productivity in social terms. What are you contributing in social well-being? And so, if you start thinking about that, at this stage in our culture and our society is not prepared to tolerate governments giving handouts to people who can work, who won't work. We just don't have the sociology yet to allow that. And so I think that within a paid work environment, we can push the boundaries on what we believe is productive outcomes. So here's my final example is, I live just near at the moment I live here all the time because of the lockdowns, but I live near some of the best surf beaches in the world. I would offer a job to the surfers under a guaranteed job to surfers. Now, what would they do? They'd go surfing and have fun and enjoy themselves. And what else might they do by way of reciprocal contribution to society? Well, one of the problems on these beaches is drowning and water difficulties during summer. Who best knows the dangers of the beaches? We do, the surfers. So I would have them as part of their responsibilities, their job, to provide water safety lessons to school kids. That would be incredibly productive in my view, but it would be within a paid work environment which is culturally appropriate at this time in history. It would give them income security and they would enjoy their lives. And we would be restoring this concept of collective will and reciprocity. That's why I don't like UBI. We'll leave it there. I think that pushes pushes John and I together in a way we can have dialogue. I don't support UBI without any reciprocal responsibilities back to society. I just think that is not a society. That's a group of individuals who have been pushed out onto the limits of society to become consumption units. That's not my idea of society.
And on that, the challenges that we face will require an all hands on deck approach, really. I mean, in tackling climate change and tackling social inequality, the social inequality crisis and economic inequality crisis and everything else that we're facing will require all hands on deck. And I think one of the comments I've noted about the job guarantee is that it sort of guarantees the distribution of the equal distribution of the obligation to work, and it doesn't leave the burden of some of those sort of the hard graft that these challenges will present us to, you know, the people that are traditionally bearing that burden.
Can I just make one more point, Jane, and so that we don't have, the audience doesn't have any misconceptions. When I talk about a job guarantee, it's a guaranteed, unconditional guaranteed job paid for by the federal government.
Yeah.
It's at a socially inclusive minimum wage. Socially inclusive means that you are able to participate fully in society, go to the footy, go to the opera, have a holiday, go on vacation, go out to dinner some nights. Socially inclusive. It's a minimum wage, so it would be much higher than the current minimum wage. And it's a minimum wage because you don't want the government competing for that labour when the private sector is growing again. That's the non-inflationary point. It has holiday pay, superannuation, sick pay, special pay. It allows workers to choose their hours. It allows workers to engage in informal on-the-job training. It would allow a worker, if they wanted to go back to university, to go back to university and be paid a wage. So it's nothing like work for all those Twitter crew that talk about it's just slavery and workfare. They haven't got a clue.
I think it has an innate respect and a positive freedom that, you know, it promotes an idea of government enabling freedoms to have, you know, participate in the real economy and to be a contributing member of society. And so the ideas of being free from the government that is often proposed with the UBI, that, you know, trying the coercive aspect that is often the criticism of a JG, which I don't see. I see it as a positive freedom to participate. So I'm going to Noel now, and I think, you know, in terms of he's already made clear his work with Bill and his commitment to a job guarantee. And Noel, are you there?
Yeah.
And I guess I am particularly curious to hear how your view on what the impact of you know an income guarantee versus a job guarantee, and particularly sort of alluding to your concerns with passive welfare and the experience that your people have had of being a marginal aspect, like experiencing a marginal aspect of the welfare state where income provisioning for people dispossessed from the real economy. So that's a quote from your Light on the Hills talk, but I just wanted to say, you know, in how you think either of those approaches may impact on your community and your people. And the health and in the long term. Yeah.
So I've been at this for 2 decades, and I don't think that I've certainly made limited headway in convincing people about the non-income benefits of work. There's still a huge denial that work provides a whole lot of psychic and personal and social benefits to people beyond the actual income. But I have to say, I live and breathe the effects of having an income but not having work. And I've got to insist that there are very important non-income benefits of a job that are as important as the actual income. I think that people who keep denying this are usually people who have worked themselves. If all you know is work and all of the personal esteem and social networks and everything else and all the opportunities that come from a job, you take that for granted. And you think that the principal advantage of having a job is the income. I think if we really want to have social progress here for disadvantaged people, we got to get over this. Come on, for fuck's sake. There are absolute benefits of work that are non-income related. Now, with many young people who are innovative and creative and educated and agile, and they can work gigs and they can invent their own jobs and they can conceive of their own businesses and so on, all very well. If the job guarantee can represent a start for those people to generate their own jobs and carve out their own startups and everything else. But in the scheme of things, in the scheme of disadvantage, don't let that be a picture of the whole. You know, I don't think that conception of a basic income, that all of a sudden that mob that I'm concerned about, at the very bottom of the pyramid are suddenly going to become people who are going to create startup jobs and enterprises and so on. That is simply that would be a presumption that we bring to the situation that is, in my view, only marginal. That can only be ever a marginal solution. And the fact is that we need a shitload of jobs. We need entry-level work. It's the disappearance of entry-level work that is such a killer for disadvantaged people. People struggling with mental illness, people struggling with the door never opening to them. Nobody's interested in giving a large section of my people a job. And so the critical question is, can we afford it? Can the country afford to give people a socially inclusive minimum wage job? That's the question we have to turn our minds to. Can the country afford it? And if the answer is yes, then why have we not been doing this? And so it's to the question of affordability that the light has switched on for me. And when you look at what we are spending money on, in my space at least, well, in the job network, the country spends $12 billion a year just to churn people at the bottom, to use people at the bottom of the pyramid almost as if they've got a barcode on their foreheads. And the job network providers just swipe the barcode in order to get a fee to place them in a job that's not real. And within a certain amount of time, that same body is brought through the process again for another fee. They're just churned. It's just churn. It's a $12 billion churn. The other place and this, just to wind up what I'm saying, the other place is the so-called $36 billion that's spent on Indigenous people in this country, according to the Productivity Commission. distributed to states and territories on the basis of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander numbers. $36 billion. Well, the Australian National Audit Office has disclosed that a very large percentage of those allocations to the states and territories, nominally in the name of Indigenous people, is for the criminal justice system, for jails, police, lawyers, courts, detention. That's where the money in Indigenous affairs is. And why aren't we spending just a fraction of that money on giving Indigenous people a job under a job guarantee so that we can avoid jail?
So I might just make comment and then hand it over to you, Tim. But I think what I've read of Bill's work and the job guarantee is that it, redefining the notion of work and what work is particularly relevant in the Aboriginal communities where your connection to land and your caring of country are important parts of important work that probably could be funded, and people could be funded to work in those roles. And also, I guess, thinking about rather than like a job guarantee seeing the job guarantee as just enforcing jobs, that, I think Bill's work has always talked about meeting the basic needs of people in sort of the welfare system as well. And so ensuring there's a basic needs guarantee in the communities in which you live.
Can I make just 2 points, Jane? I don't want to jump the queue on John or anything, and Noel, but
that's all right.
And I noticed there's some questions that relate.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done quite a bit of work in Indigenous communities in both Arnhem Land, Central Australia, and in Western New South Wales. And one of the interesting things came out. One project and I won't say where it was. This was a community, one of the big old missions, and it was a community where the youth were being destroyed by petrol sniffing. There was no work there, and we tried to get Centrelink, Faxia, Federal Government Social Services. The men had worked out, the adult men had worked out that they would occupy themselves productively by going down to the Billabong, which had been ravaged by poor fencing and cows getting onto it and soiling the quality of the water. They occupied themselves by going down to the Billabong, the turn in a major Australian river system, and they used to go down there every day and clean it. And we tried to work out a scheme where Australian government would pay for the young people to be employed on a job guarantee and be mentored by the older people. And they'd go down there and every day and work on cleaning it, and they'd tell stories about the past and connect with the land. And the guy in the Faxia said, well, that's not work. What are they going to do all day? Sitting around the river telling stories isn't work. And that's where we've got to make the break. Now, it just turned out that cleaning all of that particular bend in the major river system cleaned the water systems from pollution, and the downstream effects were dramatic. We got CSIRO to do a evaluation of the impacts upon farming downstream for the cleaner water, and it was dramatic. So even in bean counter language, it was productive. And the second thing I'd say briefly was I also did a very large project through the Australian Research Council with one of the largest mental health providers in the largest in New South Wales, the health department. And they're experts in dealing with youth with psychosis. And one of the problems we've used with psychosis is that, the illness impacts just at a crucial time when they're making transitions in their life from school to work, school to university, puberty to adulthood. And one of the problems, and when those episodic illnesses hit, those transitions are severely disrupted and they never really make it through. And we did a project with this group, the clinical experts, where we got jobs organised. No private sector employer would deal with it. And we designed job creation program for these young people with episodic illnesses where they could work. And the nature of those illnesses, of course, is that some days, mostly they're okay. And then some days without warning, they're not okay. Mm. And what we worked out was a job structure where they would have clinical support embedded in the job structure. Most of the time they were productive in the normal sense, just like any other worker in those jobs. And other times they couldn't work very much at all, and sometimes not at all. But they had instant clinical support to stop them having fits and stuff on the floor, which would discourage the non-ill workers. And that proved to be a spectacular success. And that reinforces the whole literature that if you have early intervention with job creation, people who have episodic illnesses in teenage years become quite productive adults. Their symptoms decline over time and they become much better at risk managing their own lives. And so what I learned from those things was that job guarantee can be a very flexible structure to suit all sorts of different needs, from really disadvantaged Indigenous communities that have got incredible petrol sniffing problems and all of those things, to more conventional mental illness situations, as well as much more conventional situations.
Mm. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, they perfectly illustrate that point of the flexibility and meeting needs. So Tim, would you like to take over? Do you have questions, or would you?
Usually.
You're muted. Unmute. Okay. Are you unmuted? Let me see. Yeah, you're unmuted now, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bill, for explaining in detail some of the things that I was going to raise. But my first part of my question is to John, talking about basic income guarantee. John, my understanding is that there are two broad ways of administering a basic income guarantee. The kind of approach that you're talking about, which is looking at income returns and assets, and the other way is to actually give the income up front so that it's there if things happen. As in, you give the income to everybody and then you tax it back. But people have it if, for example, they fall on hard times, they've immediately still got an income coming in. Now, would that be fair? Is that correct?
I wouldn't stress so much typically people don't stress so much the instant access as the notion of universality, that everybody, all of us here, everybody from the poorest to the richest person in the country gets it, is what a lot of people stress about that version of UBI you're describing, whereas what I've said here is we focus on basic first, ensuring that everybody has the basic income, and then think about how that can be extended. But
that's fine. So my question is going to the groups that I see that are marginalised, that Bill's been talking about, many of which can be incorporated into a jobs guarantee to get their income. I'm just wondering how comprehensive that can do the job of ensuring the income for people who struggle to even participate at the level that Bill's been talking about. I see patients every day who have got fluctuating illnesses that has been mentioned, I see some whose fluctuations are so significant they hardly ever will work. And I'm worried about those kinds of people and looking at the basic income as some kind of support for them. Another group that I'm wondering about, are covered by Bill's suggestion, is the group that women that are fleeing domestic violence and suddenly without the family income. How quickly can we have a system where they are covered immediately rather than a delayed system that leaves them penniless for some time while the cogs move on? And the other thing that I'd wonder about is there's not been any mention of the huge amount of unpaid work that housewives do in the community, and none of this registers, at least financially. Neither of these suggestions register financially to help those people who are often doing work part-time, running the house, running the kids, taking the other earners' parents to the doctor as well as their own. There's an awful lot of that that is so far, as you've discussed, not perhaps covered as well as I might like.
Sure. So, I mean, if you look at the delays that are built in the system, they're to do very largely with compliance. There's no fundamental reason why it should take you a long time to get an unemployment benefit. It's because the government's put in a set of rules that are there to make it hard. If all you had to do was go and declare I'm unemployed, and then you'd get your money and the government would afterwards check you are getting it, then I think there's no problem. Comparing that to paying out every single person in the community just in case they become unemployed, I think you can see we're talking of a budget of hundreds of billions of dollars for something that really could be addressed essentially just by calling the dogs off in terms of the obstacles put into getting access to benefits. So that's the reason why one reason why I start from the bottom up. The second is that, I think Bill makes this point. I mean, there are lots of different versions of UBI, but the ultra universal one is completely individualistic, and so in particular, it doesn't take account of the fact that people live in households. So you start with the thing: supposing you want to give the old age pension to people, do you give people the single rate, which entails also greatly increasing the rate currently paid to couples, or do you give people half of the couple rate, which would make singles a lot worse off, or somewhere in between? We have a system, an existing system, which recognises the reality that people live in households and that the needs of people in a household aren't the same as the needs of an equal number of individual people. So that's that's one version. Of course, there are many other versions of UBI, some progressive and some not, I think. And the kind of version that says, look, all these people are going to be thrown out by robots, let's just give them some money and keep them quiet, which I think is the version Bill has been criticising. I have no sympathy for. I wanted, while I've got the floor, just to say there was a question about bullshit jobs, a term of art. David Graeber used this term. And the point is, there's always been a category, people have always had these categories. In the neoliberal era, bullshit jobs were those that couldn't be supported on the market. So car workers who worked hard making cars, according to this story, had a bullshit job because they relied on tariff protection to keep their jobs. And so the free marketeers were very eager to throw them out. Jobs in Indigenous communities rarely pay their way. If you tried to assess them of saying, let's get the cheapest person to do it, it's probably a multinational corporation hiring backpackers, not a person in the community. And if you say, so that category of bullshit jobs was how the neoliberal system worked. Looking at the critique, we see now it's jobs in the finance sector, for example. People getting huge amounts of money for achieving very little indeed. So there's always a category of real and bullshit in there, and part of the participation income story is to say, putting in 15 hours a week volunteering is a contribution which is just as valid as putting in 80 hours a week, shaving 1/1000th of a percentage point off the interest rate swap on some financial derivative. And so I think there's, as Noel was saying, there's very much a question of self-respect, and that's partly a matter of the attitudes we have to work as well as the actual content of that work.
Okay.
Bill, have you got any comments on the unpaid work that I was talking about, and just how well we can adjust the kind of matching of jobs to the capabilities of people?
Yeah, I can talk about that. First of all, you'll note I mentioned unconditional. It's an unconditional program. At the moment, all of our income support is highly conditional. And what I mean by unconditional is that the day a person finds that they need a job and they can't get one, they go straight down, or they file an online application these days, but I'm aware that a lot of people are still disadvantaged with internet access.
Mm-hmm.
So they go to whatever the interface with government is that's appropriate for them. And the day they submit the form, they're on a job guarantee wage. The very day. And if it takes a week to get the banking system or the cash transfer going, it gets backdated. So there's no, in the way I conceive this process, no delay at all. Now, then there's those who say, well, why don't we keep unemployment benefits so that people can job search and, you know, rearrange their lives if they become jobless? Well, the way I can see the job guarantee is that you might get 4 to 6 weeks grace. You go on the wage straight away, a socially inclusive wage, living wage, straight away, and you don't have to report to work for maybe 4 to 6 weeks. So you can take your chances in the labour market and do some searching. You can paint your house. You can get over the horror of losing your job. You can do family things, whatever you want. You can have a holiday. So I don't see that if the government's got a responsibility to provide that, we need unemployment benefits anymore. Now, what about the other category that you mentioned? And when I worked in this with these mental health professionals, I learned a hell of a lot about sort of human frailty and things that I hadn't understood, the things that you were rehearsing here tonight. People who are really disadvantaged, people who really find it hard to negotiate daily life. Well, that's why you have other forms of income support. And I can see that you can design and why I said the job guarantee was a very flexible structure was that ordinarily those youth with psychosis would be considered under disability support benefits under our current system. Now, but they like working. And so we have these binary classifications in our income support, in our welfare system, that I think we can avoid. So I think a worker with severe personal difficulties, and I go back to my early experience as a young man working on the rail yards in Victoria, there were people that were in terrible shape there. And they couldn't string together a week's work, but they could string together a day's work. And what I want is a system where they would qualify for what we call disability support benefits, but they could also have the option of some days going to work if that's what they wanted to do. So I think we can avoid that. And the other thing that I would say is about unpaid work. And I think one of the great anomalies of GDP measurement and how we measure progress in our society through gross domestic product, that's actual production that's paid for, is that if I was a house husband bringing up a family, that production wouldn't count to GDP. But if I hire someone to look after my kids while I go out and be a professor, the wage I pay the housekeeper is counted as production. Now that's ridiculous. And so the job guarantee can be flexible enough to allow mothers or fathers who want to bring up their kids and contribute to all the ways in which you mentioned. They can be job guarantee workers. Why not? Why not get a socially inclusive minimum wage as recognition that you're contributing to society by providing safe environments for your children and maybe your children's friends and all the other things that mothers and fathers do by way of child rearing. So I've got no problem with that. And the last thing I'd say is a response to John about bullshit jobs. 100% agree. If there's this vilification of so-called make work jobs, but you go back to the Great Depression, and I come from Victoria. One of the biggest current tourist resources once we get over the lockdown has always been the Great Ocean Road that runs from sort of Torquay down to Apollo Bay. Well, that was built during the 1930s with make work bullshit jobs. Government created jobs of men in big road gangs drilling out road from the cliffs. So that bullshit set of jobs has created a multi-billion-dollar tourist resource for Victoria and the nation. And if you go to America, there's countless examples of huge job creation schemes during the 1930s, which have left lasting resources for society that are highly valuable.
Thank you very much. To me, it sounds like the inclusivity of the job guarantee as Bill presents it kind of goes so close to your ideas, John, that there must be a way for you to get into bed together.
Well, certainly, I think people fight over small differences when the gap between all of us and what's actually happening with the government, and for that matter with the Labor Party. I occasionally get into these disputes over small things, but I try and get out of them as fast as possible, rather than fighting over the details. I think we can push forward together to develop these ideas, and should they ever, they're certainly a lot closer to the real political agenda now than they were 10 or 20 years ago when we started on this. By the time they get into the political sausage machine out again, you probably won't recognise them, no matter where we say.
Thank you very much. So I think, Jane, perhaps we should be having a look at some of these questions.
Yeah, I think we have a couple of questions about the how can we overcome some of these issues, some of the issues that we have currently in the current political climate. We have an anonymous attendee who's asked a question along those lines. Michael Sanderson has also asked, in terms of the current political system, the two-party political system, is it going to be an impediment to changing our social and economic system? And yeah, I suppose, is there, can Jonathan?
I think we have views, but probably the politics of it, I think, is something that's best left to political action, and we can do that at another time. But I think it's probably better just talk about the ideas and then let either participate in political movements or let political actors take them and run with them. Yeah.
It might be interesting to hear from Noel, though, about how he's interfaced with government, given that he's on the policy edge, whereas John and I are in the ivory tower somewhat.
Okay. My background shows this.
Is Noel are you there still? And we might come back to Noel, and perhaps he can reflect on his experience with politicians. We might go to another question. We have, there's quite a few questions. One from Lachlan McCall in terms of the similarities between the job guarantee proposal developed in 1994 with John Langmore and the MMT job guarantee.
I think we already covered that point. I
Yeah.
did see the question and tried to respond to it.
Yeah,
so.
I thought it had, yeah. So a lot of these questions we may have covered. Is there anyone who particularly has a question? They can raise their hand, but I'll keep going through some of the questions here. We have one from Nicholas Gruen, who has said, I think, no, something about the New
He's
Zealand.
responding.
Pardon?
I think Nicholas is responding to a previous question.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And here's a question, another question for Noel, but I don't think he's back yet. So what lessons are there to learn from successful initiatives like the Barmer services in terms of implementing the job guarantee? So has anyone, let's see, has anyone raised their hand? We have two people who would like to ask a question.
And Tim, maybe.
Jane, just to take one of the questions there to Bill, I presume, are there any countries in the world that currently have a jobs guarantee system?
No, but let me tell you that there are several countries that have got versions of it. So, for example, I've done a lot of work in South Africa under the Expanded Public Works Program. And this guaranteed a certain number of hours of work to families. And it was targeted in the provinces, but in the townships. And the first 5 years of that program, 1 million people were in work. And our evaluation of the first 5 years showed that every single person within that program moved above the international poverty line, which is pathetic poverty line, but it's an improvement relative to what they were, where they were. And very importantly, they were able to better risk manage their own affairs, and the school outcomes for their children started to improve. They started to have textbooks for the first time in their little homes. And so the second 5-year plan is aimed to 4 million or something like that. It was a spectacularly successful program, notwithstanding some of the organisational difficulties. The Indian government brought in the NREGA scheme, the National Rural Employment Guarantee. And the motivation for that program, that's employed millions of people, and it's ongoing, and they're expanding it now in the pandemic. And the motivation for that program was to, because of the growing industrialisation and the growing middle class in India and the urbanisation, their cities were getting completely choked by people moving from the rural areas, which are extremely poor, to the cities. And so to discourage that movement from the rural areas to the cities, because the cities couldn't cope, they then created guaranteed work right through the rural sectors of the country. Massive, millions employed, massive improvement in their standards of living. There were clearly problems relating to cultural things like the caste system and a bit of corruption, but improvement. In 2001, we became involved in the Argentinian crash, and that's when their export markets collapsed. They defaulted on all their debt, and they were in terrible strife. And it just happened that the senior advisor of the Ministry of Employment had been to a seminar that myself and Randall Ray had given in Chicago 2 years earlier, and that was about job guarantee. So they introduced what was called the Jefes program, the Head of Households program, which guaranteed a certain number of hours of work for one person in each household. The jobs were all decided locally and they were funded nationally. They created something like 700,000 jobs in 2 quarters. And that benefited women particularly. They were the beneficiaries of that work. The jobs were fantastic, all very innovative jobs that local communities had decided. And then and that underpinned the recovery, because that put the floor under the collapse in domestic demand, which then allowed the economy to recover. So they're examples. They're not quite the way I conceive of a job guarantee, but they're examples of how that sort of guaranteed work is incredibly beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to go to Lachlan McCall, who's going to ask a question live. So I'm just going to switch him on now. So you can go, Lachlan.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everyone. I had a stupidly long question earlier, but I think it's largely been addressed. I think pretty much we all agree about the importance of a living wage and a public option in the labour market and the job guarantee. So, as you know, the current minimum wage is around $39,000 a year. I'm a public sector unionist. Our entry-level jobs in the public service, APS 1 jobs, range from between 41,000 and 49,000. If all of you had to sort of pick a rough sort of bracket, what sort of annual wage do you think the job guarantee should be set at? Thank you.
I could start, I guess. So I'm putting forward two policies. One is the livable income guarantee, where the payment is set at the old age pension. So the question is more what kind of hours of participation would be needed to satisfy the participation requirements, and working back from the minimum wage, you get something like 15 hours. So that's the typical kind of amount that we've been looking at. As I say, my focus in full employment is probably less on the guarantee and more on the outcome, so that I will be focusing more on creating public sector jobs right from the low end of the scale right up to the middle parts of the scale, expanding the public sector in general, rather than with then job creation being really the residual part of the program rather than the core of it. So maybe I'll toss to Bill for how he sees his version of the job guarantee.
Thanks, John. Look, I should emphasise that I see the job guarantee as being a very small program, a really tiny program. It's a buffer of jobs. And when I go back to the full employment era, that buffer used to go up and down a bit. When the private sector was weak, the buffer would go up a bit. And so the public sector employment at that low end would just become a little bit bigger. So there were more people working in local government, in parks and gardens and whatever, than not. And then when the private sector was strong, the buffer would go down. So that when I talk about a job guarantee, I just see it as a part of a suite. It's not a panacea. It's just base level infrastructure that's part of a sophisticated society that's aiming to protect the most disadvantaged. Now, for most people, would never want to take one of those jobs. They would never need to. But for some segments of society, that might be their full-time job forever. Just as those jobs were full-time jobs forever in the full employment era. And so my preference always, and I think this resonates with what John just said, is that we should be aiming to create high-paid, high-skilled, good jobs, secure jobs with good career development, good upward mobility prospects over the course of your life cycle, doing all sorts of things that provide well-being for people. And that should be in the career public service. And the job guarantee just reinforces that to smooth out the fluctuations in economic activity driven by private spending fluctuations. Now, in answer to Lachlan's question, what would the job guarantee wage be? And this goes back to my work in South Africa. I was asked to design their minimum wage framework. And part of the development of that was interacting with people like the IMF and what have you. And that was a life experience in itself. But my argument from the base starting point was that and this also reflects work I've done for unions over many years in the minimum wage hearings in Australia, in what you know, the living wage hearings, is that my philosophical position is that the minimum wage should not be a capacity to pay concept in terms of private profit. The minimum wage should be the minimum level of material living standard that a society is willing to tolerate to be a sophisticated society. And so your lowest paid, and if the private sector can't meet that, well, then we don't want those private sector employers employing people. We want them to go away. And we want to create a dynamic efficiency in the economy where those employers, if they want to stay in business, have to invest in better capital and increase productivity so they can pay higher wages. Now, what does a minimum wage then mean, a socially inclusive minimum wage? It means that you have a full participation in society. So we go to the football or the opera. We go out to dinner occasionally when we get over this pandemic. We can go on a holiday, whether it be a camping trip or a trip to New Zealand or something, that we can risk manage our lives. And I think that's considerably higher than the lowest wage that we currently call the minimum. How much higher? That needs to be worked out by what's required to be socially inclusive. And I haven't done that work. I did it for South Africa, but I haven't done it for Australia. But it would be much higher than the current Fair Work Commission's minimum wage.
Bill, we're very conscious of time. We've got very little time, so I might end with a question for Noel.
Yeah.
And we had some questions about the politics and how we can realistically achieve sort of transformative and radical change that we're talking about in the current political climate, especially in the light of the recent budget, which Bill, has his analysis has shown will contribute to probably, or where 18 to 20% of the willing and available workforce will remain idle in one way or another for the next 2 years. And so, Noel, the question really is that Bill noted that you've had quite a bit of experience in political lobbying, and if you have any insights into how we can bring about some transformative change, the change that's required.
Let me construct a metaphor. I think if we think about the Australian economy and the pillars of public sector work next to the pillar of private sector jobs and next to the emerging pillar of startup jobs and so on, underneath that structure sits the acceptance of unemployment. 4, 5, 6% unemployment. All those pillars sit on a foundation of unavoidable, apparently, and inevitable unemployment. The job guarantee is about changing that foundation. Changing that foundation at the bottom and inserting a job guarantee as a foundation of work, understanding that those other pillars are where we want to get people to eventually. Maximum participation of disadvantaged people in proper, well-paid public sector work, private sector job opportunities, and for those that can start up their own jobs, people creating their own magic. It is the foundation that we're talking about here. Should it be 5% of people permanently unemployed, or should it be those people immediately having access to a job guarantee the minute they don't have a job? And of course, when it comes to this question of whether that job guarantee job is worthwhile or not, whether it's bullshit or valuable, my metric for measuring the value of that job is what that income earner can do, not just in their, what effect it has on their own life, but in the life of the family, to strengthen the family so that the children of these disadvantaged people have a chance in life, so that the children grow up in a stable home with happy parents and have a chance in life to get a good primary education, to get a good secondary education, and end up down the track, we're talking 15, 20 years down the track, those children actually probably don't need a job guarantee. They're going to get a good paying public sector job or a private sector job, or they're going to start up their own company. All because we invested in his or her parents with a job guarantee. It is about giving hope to those disadvantaged families, build a foundation for those people to break the cycle of poverty and misery and exclusion, and start to take a share in the country, take a fair share of the country, and not be relegated to holding up the edifice because everybody's resigned themselves that disadvantaged people should remain in the unemployment queues ad infinitum. So that to me is the metric. You know, you don't need to do much. You know, if you give families access to a job, give them access to a good home, give them access to a good school, make sure that they've got good health services for all of the members of the family, all of those magic ingredients to support families, we can start to break these cycles of poverty and disadvantage. You know, we can't lose hope. We've lost hope in the most disadvantaged communities. And we think that this cycle of exclusion and misery is their lot. And I just believe that, and I've seen it, I see it. If you support people in some basic ways to set up their children for a better life, you can start to break these cycles. And so that to me is the metric of the value of a job, not whether some prick at the BCA thinks that it's a worthwhile job or anything. You know, people looking down at their noses. My father was a very humble worker. He had no extraordinary skills or education, but he set me up for a life. And it's the case all over the place. All over the place, people started to improve their lot because their families were able to get their act together and set their children up for a better life than they had. And that's why I think we're going to rebuild, we're going to renovate the Australian economy. And the first renovation we need is to put a new foundation, not the acceptance of a permanent 5% unemployment, but a job guarantee. It's only the foundation. We also need more access to public sector jobs. We need a revitalised private sector economy. And all of that is necessary work to do. If we don't have the underpinning of a job guarantee for those people who would otherwise have nothing, they would otherwise have nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Jane,
Yep.
I just wonder if I could make a comment.
Sure.
One of the ideas that we're trying to tease out is how we move this kind of idea up into the public imagination. And as I said I think in my introduction, I'm concerned that this being such a crucial health issue, that health organisations throughout the country that are doing all sorts of good small work are not advocating to look at the structural changes. Now, there's a lot of people on this webinar, and there are people who'll watch the video recording of it, who are interested and in various organisations that have the potential to be taking this idea on and putting it up and constructing, if not a policy, at least working with people like Bill and John and others to see if we can turn this around in a major way. And it should be incumbent upon a health organisation that has any values of social justice that they start looking much, much harder at these big structural issues. So I would exhort those people who are listening, who are such members, in fact, especially the ones who are senior members, to look seriously at how their organisation can come together and do something about it.
I think we might have to wind it up because our webinar session is till 8 at the very latest.
Can I just make one statement, Jane?
Sure, yeah.
Just following up on what Tim said, that Noel and I are trying to build what you called it a coalition. We're trying to build something, you could call it a movement, an awareness, something. Let's not title it yet. But I'm very happy to talk to any of the subgroups within your organisation, Tim and Jane, and I do a lot of workshops for unions and community groups, and my feeling is that what's missing is people don't have the insights into the economic possibilities. And so once they learn that there's no question of how the government can pay for all of this, then they see the fiscal space and the opportunities in a much broader way. And so if you want to facilitate ongoing education within your group and anybody else who's listening, I'm very happy at any time to participate and help. That's sort of my role as an educator. And thanks very much for organising this.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I think we do have to wind it up, but I really appreciate your time, the generosity of giving your time tonight. We've been 2 hours now, which is incredible. And we have a lot of questions that we just can't get to, and I apologise for that. I think there's a chance that we may continue a series with Bill and Noel, and we may look at other speakers such as John as well, as a part of the organisation I work with called Modern Money Australia. So yeah, please, just putting a shameless plug in for them, but we could potentially do something like that down the track. And thank you to Public Health Association for hosting us. Yeah. Tomorrow night there's another webinar on which is been organised by the Political Economy of Health Special Interest Group, which is focusing on COVID-19 and the sort of vaccines and trade policy, I believe it's on. And thank you everyone for coming along. We had about over 100 people at the peak, and I really appreciate you all staying till the end. So very grateful. Thank you. And Tim, I'll let you.
Thank you very much to all three of you, and thank you also to the audience. And my exhortation remains, we must move on.